going to tell you 3 things about American childhood in 1999. First of all, according to the FCC, kids were watching an average of 28 hours of television every week. Number 2, Nickelodeon was the most watched cable network across the USA. And number 3, SpongeBob debuted and was an instant hit. Long story short, if you were a kid around the new millennium, you probably watched SpongeBob. And if you watched it as often as it was on, you would have seen it a lot. But you weren't watching it simply because it was on all the time, and it probably wasn't because of the constant reminders of SpongeBob at every single meal that he had somehow infiltrated back then. No, instead, you were watching it because it was captivating. And in this video, we're going to talk about what made it so. But first, a quick quiz. Can you finish these lines from the show?
Is mayonnaise an instrument?
No, Patrick, mayonnaise is not an instrument. Horseradish is not an instrument either.
Let's see. Inattentive, impatient, a glazed look in the eyes. Look carefully at the "I really wish I weren't here right now" button.
Did you have a lot of the show memorized? I did. Just about every line of the first 3 seasons. When I got to college in 2010, I realized I was not the only one. One day, freshman year, a bunch of girls on my floor were watching SpongeBob, crowded around a laptop, as you did in 2010, and we were all reciting it in real time as it played.
Now that I've got you right where I want you,
I'd like to buy some chocolate.
Later that evening, one of the girls and I were sitting on the communal kitchen countertops talking at 2 a.m., as you did in college. We were having, what we thought was deep conversation, as you do in your youth. But she said something that's actually stuck with me for years. She said she felt like she'd wasted her brain space on SpongeBob quotes. And this filled me with dread, because if anyone wasted brain space on SpongeBob quotes, that was me. If you've seen my other videos, you've heard my whole spiel about how our brains are neuroplastic when we're young. But as a quick recap, or if you're new here, basically all you need to know is that kid brains are searching for information and patterns about how the world works. Adult brains think they've got it all figured out and aren't as keen on, say, making the association between a circle on a set of 5 lines and a note on a piano. And me, I never learned how to play an instrument with sheet music. I never learned any languages in my youth, and I was exactly who the FCC was talking about when they reported that kids were watching 28 hours of television every week. If you have ever feared, like I have, that you wasted your brain space on SpongeBob instead of learning something useful, this video is for you. While watching this show might not have turned us into scholars, perhaps it did set us up with a foundation for understanding, or at least appreciating art. Why? Because SpongeBob moved like opera. And I'm not kidding. If you revisit SpongeBob now with just a few basic understandings of opera in mind, I think you'll find that you didn't waste your time. In fact, you may just have a lot to carry with you if you wish to pursue anything creative. Quick question, what is opera? There's obviously a lot to say about opera, but I'll try to keep it quick. Opera is a dramatic art tracing back to 16th century Italy. Performers tell a story on stage, typically only through song, not spoken dialogue. Opera sets are elaborate and artful and should always establish a clear sense of place. Some of the most famous operas are Carmen, Aida, and dozens of Mozart ones like The Marriage of Figaro and The Magic Flute. Opera is meant to evoke the deepest emotions it can by reflecting the ultimate highs and lows known to humankind. Opera music will stick with you for a long time. For example, I've never seen a production of Carmen, not even on YouTube. I've never sat down and thought, I'm going to listen to the music from Carmen today. Maybe you and I have that in common, and if we do, I'll bet that something else we have in common is that we can hum this tune pretty well from memory. But why? We never chose to commit it to memory. We've perhaps never even actively listened. More on this later, but for now, my point is that opera sticks with you. But that's only if you're able to access it. And most of us couldn't, especially not as kids. But even now, for many of us, accessing opera is out of the question, especially if we're talking about a live version. Attending opera is expensive. Buying something to wear to an opera is expensive. And as far as just watching it on YouTube, that can also be expensive in terms of time. The language and motifs are often complicated and sometimes take up free time to study ahead of watching, and we don't always have free time. So access was and remains limited. But a lot of us had access to SpongeBob. You already know what SpongeBob is. But to sum it up, it's that cartoon from 1999 that's still running today after more than 250 episodes, 15 Kids' Choice Awards, and 6 Emmys. It's that show that became a multi-billion-dollar franchise, yes, with a B, after it was translated into more than 50 languages, spun off into movies and musicals and merch. It was created by an actual marine biologist, Steven Hillenburg, and that probably makes the whole thing funnier because the show is hilariously unscientific, you know, with all that electricity and fast food and fire and squirrels living under the sea. It's absurd comedy, following the antics of the title character, who looks nothing like a sea sponge, but rather something you do the dishes with. And so, in conclusion, these two things, opera and SpongeBob, are clearly not the same. Of course not. But if you look closer at the structural elements, you can see some similarities. Let's talk about 3 elements of opera that show up in SpongeBob and how these elements make the show captivating, memorable, and, yes, artistic. The first of the 3 elements that SpongeBob and opera share is musicality. So, SpongeBob did feature some absolute bangers, but I want to focus on dialogue. Unlike opera, the lines of SpongeBob are nowhere near completely sung. Nevertheless, a lot of them sound like song. Catchy songs capable of getting stuck in your head all day long are called earworms. Earworms follow patterns that brains like. They're repetitive, they have distinct and pleasing rhythms and rises and falls in tone that our brains find interesting. And bonus, if a piece has changes in tempo or volume throughout, that will also keep our attention from straying. These are the reasons why you know this melody so well. The different elements of musicality are very intriguing for your brain. SpongeBob lines often work the same way. Sometimes they were repetitive.
What I learned in boarding school is what I learned in boarding school.
But they weren't so repetitive that we got bored. There were also plenty of changes in tempo and volume that kept us engaged.
Except he wasn't a sponge. So it didn't grow back.
The lines were often so melodic that you could play them on a piano.
I'm ready, I want those boots. Imagination.
And they were often so rhythmic that you could tap out the rhythm on a drum and fans would know the line.
I can't understand your accent.
Another way that the show used rhythm to push the story forward was the way they'd mix it up in any given episode. Slowness was the right moment to work in more subtle humor. Those more tightly paced moments usually emphasized general chaos. Unlike other hit cartoons at the time, which usually stuck to more steady pacing or gradual build-ups in a given episode, SpongeBob's rhythms were dynamic and varied, and this kept us engaged. It was so engaging and so pleasing to our brains that many of us absorbed all the dialogue from the show without even trying. What other features did this show share with opera? Well, let's talk voice. Opera voices should tell you a lot about who the character is. A high and fluty and more fragile voice like Princess Pamina's in The Magic Flute conveys innocence and purity, whereas a much deeper and more bellowing style, such as that of Carmen, implies more features of seduction and power. I was trying to write out a description of SpongeBob's voice for this script, and, well, I started thinking about the time I worked in a call center. They told me to smile when talking on the phone, even though obviously the person on the other end couldn't see me. But the bosses said there was a big difference in how someone talked when they were smiling and when they weren't. Can you tell I'm smiling now? As much as I hated this job and did not want to smile, I found this to be true, and I also find this is the best way to describe SpongeBob's default voice. Okay, that's enough of that. Basically, SpongeBob sounds like he's smiling whenever he's talking, and Patrick's slow and deep voice obviously captured his default mode of dopey confusion, and Squidward's slightly monotone nasal voice conveyed boredom. Okay, guys, I'm sorry, I'm really not good at these impressions. But anyway, Squidward's voice conveyed boredom and unfulfillment and resignation. Even if someone had never seen SpongeBob before and they heard just one given line from one specific voice,
Can't see my forehead.
they may have been able to accurately infer a lot about that character. I'm not so sure that this would be the case for most big cartoons at the time. Next, I have a 2 for 1. I want to talk about extravagance and expression together. Just about nothing in opera is subtle. It typically involves big and ornate costumes and elaborate set designs. SpongeBob was perhaps not the most visually extravagant cartoon, and overall, I don't think the tied concept of extravagance and visual art is the strongest parallel between the two. But I do think that the tied concept of extravagance and expression is. Facial expressions and gesture in opera are a spectacle. Since opera is limited to what can only be done with human performers in a live show, we don't have moments where opera performers actually shrink in size or deflate like balloons or cry tears concrete enough to turn into a sweater. This is obviously the stuff of cartoons, and cartoons have no limits as far as ways to creatively and boisterously convey emotion. Live performances are more limited. But opera performers take it all the way to the limit of what is humanly possible. In my observation, opera performers make their gestures and expressions as big as they can while keeping it artful. SpongeBob, without these limits, can turn emotions into surreal explosions of feeling. Now, when we see SpongeBob in a surreal explosion of deep, deep sadness, we're not necessarily meant to feel the deep, deep sadness that we would in, say, a Verdi opera like La Traviata, in which the protagonist, Violetta, falls to tuberculosis. No, because SpongeBob is usually crying over something silly, like getting fired, when a simple explanation would get him his job back, or an entitled customer being rude. Those aren't exactly deeply serious tragedies. But that's also part of what makes this show so funny. Viewers can only imagine what it would take to make us cry so much that it fills a coffee mug, or to cry so hard that we become deflated completely. And whatever that is, it's not the thing SpongeBob is crying over. The expressions convey and express deep, deep sadness in a way that no other cartoon really ever has. But rather than us deeply empathizing or walking away with a heavy heart, we laugh because the spectacle of emotion in SpongeBob doesn't match the situation the way that it does in the grave stories of opera. SpongeBob's situation is always absurd, and if I were to make a video essay about all the ways SpongeBob and opera were different, well, themes and stories would probably be at the top. Nevertheless, the theatricality of expression is the top thing, in my opinion, that they have in common. To be clear, SpongeBob isn't opera. Its humor is childish and lowbrow. Oftentimes, it seems like it's trying to be dumb on purpose. SpongeBob isn't trying to evoke a strong emotional reaction or insight into the human experience like Mozart or Verdi did. And speaking of Mozart, he was gone from this world at age 35. And people still study his work, and they still find new ways to interpret it. Opera is deliberately sophisticated, and it's meant to be taken seriously. If you want to take on opera in any professional capacity, it's competitive, and you'll still never become very rich or even all that famous if you make it. But it's more about honoring the history and keeping the art alive. Opera deserves respect, and this video isn't here to pretend that a cartoon is equivalent in sophistication or artistic standards. And furthermore, this video essay was made by someone who's never even been to an opera. I'm sure there are opera experts who would take offense to this statement on a surface level. Opera's just like SpongeBob. I don't mean to make light of the craft or the high arts or intellectualism, especially in the days where it seems like intellectualism is under attack. So why even bother putting this video out there? Because SpongeBob was what we had. You probably know this tune. And if you've made it this far in the video, you probably know this tune. Both tunes are earworms, but if you're like me, you can only fully explain what's going on in one of these songs. If you grew up in the United States at the turn of the millennium, chances are you watched a lot of TV. In that 1999 FCC report, they said an average kid would go on to watch 18,000 hours of television before high school graduation. For some kids, it was surely less, but for many, it could have been even more. But no matter what, the average kid in America couldn't choose high art. So for entertainment, we took what was in front of us. And with SpongeBob, we stuck with it because it was so captivating. And maybe that's because it shares commonalities with the high arts, as dumb as this show seems on a surface level. Opera is a great triumph of humanity, but it was always and continues to be very exclusive. But maybe the same patterns that made it such a triumph found their way to the common folk. And so to anyone worrying that they wasted their brain real estate on SpongeBob, first off, that's not quite how it works, even though it's true that it's harder to learn some things now as adults, but you didn't waste your time. You have a lot to take with you from the show. If you want to learn a new language, go watch SpongeBob in that target language. Your brain knows the beats, the rhythms, the stories. You have so much context for hearing and contextualizing new vocabulary. Or if you're an artist, watch it again as an adult. Watch it if you want to make any kind of art that tells a story. Think of the way the varying tempos keep the audience tuned in. Watch the dramatic silences burst into dramatic punchlines. Think of the ensemble energy that mimicked an onstage chorus, and think of what a complete antithesis of a main character can look like. In conclusion, you didn't memorize SpongeBob just because you watched it a lot. It was more because the show was engineered the way that truly captivating and memorable stories are engineered. They may live in your head, but it's not a waste. Thank you for being here. If you have not subscribed already, please do, because we have a lot of fun Y2K era nostalgic content on this channel. Some of it is silly like this, but others are a little serious and a little more research-based, so make sure to check out the channel page, subscribe, and see what it is you like. Thanks for watching, and be sure to tell me why I am uncultured in the comments below, comparing SpongeBob to opera and everything. I hope to see you again soon.